CC Writer. I have watched some of Phil Spickler's YouTube videos. As you know, he is Mimi Rogers' father, Tom Cruise's ex-father-in-law, and knew LRH from 1950 to when he left the church in 1980. He has said that LRH was very innovative given that he was experimenting with self-help for the masses in the 1950s after World War II, which such a thing was completely new. Spickler says he treasures his time from 1950 to 62 or so when there was real work and innovation going on. After that, LRH went off the rails completely. Unfortunately, he hasn't explained how this transformation came about. What do you think about this? I've talked to a couple people who were around back in the 1950s, and Scientology was a wholly different scene back then. Very, very less regulated, very less strict. Many of the organizational things that came about, that like the whole ethics and the justice and the sec checking, all that, you know, the pulling of all of your crimes and this sort of thing, all of that started in the 1960s. In the 1950s, it was a very freewheeling, woohoo sort of thing, and there were a lot of people contributing. It wasn't all just about L. Ron Hubbard, and people knew other people were contributing. They knew it wasn't all just L. Ron Hubbard. He was definitely the leader, and he was definitely the one who was leading the charge, but there were other people who people knew by name, who were contributing and who were part of the development of the technology of Scientology. And it was a freer, looser time, as that's been described to me. People were doing drugs while they were auditing. I mean, it was very loosey-goosey. There was a lot more, just a lot of things that wouldn't be tolerated in Scientology now. It was around the 1960s when Hubbard moved to St. Hill Manor in East Grinstead in Sussex, England, that he decided he needed to start taking a more iron grip control of what was going on with Scientology. I think this had to do with government investigations and interference. I think this had to do with maintaining tax exemption, and I think it had to do with Hubbard's own ideas about where Scientology was going. Because he'd been screwing around for 10 years, promising people clear, 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 you're going to go clear, and he wasn't really particularly delivering the goods on that. And then he thought at some point in the late 50s and early 60s that he had finally hit on a way to get anybody to clear, and he started really talking about and pushing this concept of OT, operating Thetan, where you could, move way beyond clear. And he had changed his mind about a number of things over the years, like from Dianetics, right? Like, for example, in Dianetics, Hubbard talks about the analytical mind and the reactive mind. Well, by the 1960s, Hubbard had decided that the analytical mind was really the Thetan, the spiritual being. And it wasn't a separate part of your mind, it was you. And you had this reactive mind, but the nature of the reactive mind, Hubbard had moved on and done new developments where he thought he'd hit on these new mental mechanisms and problems and things that are called GPMs. I won't get into all the technical on it, goals, problem, masses, like whatever. But he sort of changed, had changed his ideas about this stuff. And so in the 1960s, he not only developed these OT levels and said that they were confidential and very harmful if you are exposed to them before you're ready, but he also then felt the need to establish this ethics and justice system, and he also started getting very, very, very paranoid about groups working against him and against Scientology. There were some media articles that happened in the early 1960s and mid-1960s that he had done interviews for. I can't remember the publication, but there was one in particular that really, really pissed him off. He had done some interview, I think it was the Saturday Evening Post. And I think it was that. And he'd given this interview and they just lambasted him. And I think he felt very personally betrayed by that. Then, of course, the IRS was sniffing around, and the FBI raid in I think that was 63, where Hubbard had written to John F. Kennedy and said, hey, we're here to help you guys. And of course, Hubbard wrote off a lot of letters to the government, many of them accusing his detractors of being communists. So it wasn't like he wrote one letter and the FBI came after him. They had a whole file of stuff on this guy. He came off to the government, if you look at a lot of his letters, as a total paranoid, delusional nutcase. So when he was starting to make, motions toward the president, I think they got a little nervous about that. But regardless, they knew that he was personally profiting from Scientology, and they were coming after him in court. So Hubbard's level of paranoia got to a point where he felt he needed to really come down with an iron fist on his own people and his own organization. And that was in the 1962 was a pretty good point for when that really started. And so you see these developments, and of course by 1967 he's off roaming the seas with the Sea Organization, and the Sea Organization came around and started coming around the orgs in the late 60s, and were enforcing very draconian measures on the staff in order to get them making money and get them into production. So that became, Scientology started getting more heavy-handed at that point, and it really only got worse and worse as the years went on, as I have talked about on my channel ad nauseum. So that is, I think, why Phil was saying what he was saying. You find a lot of, I mentioned earlier in this episode, I talked about independent Scientologists. A lot of independent Scientologists are old school Scientologists from the 50s and 60s and 70s, when it was at the public level a lot looser, a lot less restricted, a lot less ethics and justice on people, a lot less threats and punishment. Now Scientology is much more that than it was back then. And if you want to get a real good compare and contrast on this, watch the interview that I did with my mom. It's on the front page of my channel, and she and I talk about these differences in a lot of detail. So you can also check that out too.